You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
You know, there's sometimes in our life where we need an excuse to get out of something we don't want to do. May I recommend, if you ever find yourself in that situation, have kids. They are the best out you can get. Like, yeah, I'd love to help you move, but my kid's got this thing, I don't think I can. Or, I can't come into work today, my kid's not feeling great, I should stay behind. The plan's not foolproof. Generally, more likely than not, the presence of kids also means that when you want to do something, you can't because the same reasons ruin everything. But who's going to argue about the importance of taking care of kids? And the answer is people on airplanes. If it's a kid that's crying, they're rotten to the core and need to learn to be quiet. And if it's my precious baby angels, they probably have a good reason to be crying. So why don't you mind your own business, you monster? Our passage today is exploring how kids reveal our heart and how we might welcome the weakest among us. This is Luke chapter 9, verse 37 through 48. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met Jesus. And just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He's my only child." Suddenly a spirit will seize him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth and mauls him and scarcely leaves him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. And Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son to me." And while he was coming, the demon dashed the child to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father, and all were astounded at the greatness of God. And while everyone was amazed at all that he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands." But they did not understand this saying. Its meaning was concealed from them so that they could not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about what he was saying. An argument arose among them as to which one of them would be the greatest. But Jesus, aware of their inner thoughts, took a little child and put it by his side and said to them, "Whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who has sent me. For the least among all of you is the greatest." So Luke chapter 9 is a pivotal point in Jesus' story. It begins with Jesus explaining to his followers for the first time how they will now turn their eyes toward Jerusalem and their journey will take them there, and that when he arrives there, he will be arrested and tortured and killed. This is also where we get the famous line, "Take up your cross and follow me." Because it's not only Jesus who will find himself in trouble on this road, that any who would follow him would find themselves walking to Jerusalem and walking to their death. The story then shifts to this story of the Transfiguration, where Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up to the top of a mountain and reveals his glory to them, unveils himself, and the glory shines off, and not only with him, but also Moses and Elijah are there, and the voice of God from heaven speaks. And Peter gets an idea. It would be better if we just stay here, guys. Let's just build a campsite for Jesus and Moses and Elijah, and we'll just bunk together and never leave this mountain. Because remember what Jesus said, to go from this mountain is to go to Jerusalem, and to go to Jerusalem is to go to die. But God's not having any of that. Like, good idea, Peter, but the voice from heaven speaks and says, "This is my son, listen to him, follow him." Somehow, God's glory and salvation is going to be wrapped up in Jesus' death. And to embrace the shining face of Christ on this mountain is to also commit to following it to the hills outside of Jerusalem, especially those that are dotted with crosses. And so we come to our passage this morning that as Jesus comes down the mountain, we will find a declaration, again reminding the disciples that in the midst of all the celebration that's happening, there is some very real life that's about to occur too. And that they will commit to continuing on the road to Jerusalem and find themselves threatened with death. So if that's the meat of the story, the bread of this very miserable sandwich are stories about Jesus and kids. And that might be kind of surprising, like, why bring kids into the midst of this, Jesus? This is terrible stuff. Well, we find that within the collision of power and powerlessness, kids are right in the middle of it. And so first we read of a boy who's struck by seizures, foaming at the mouth, shrieking in pain, falling to the ground and being cut and bruised. And the disciples seem to be ineffective against this sort of power. Not a medical condition from Luke's perspective, even though Luke would be a physician at the time, but Luke considers this to be more of a spiritual condition, that the boy is oppressed by demons, so much so that the nearer he draws to Jesus, the more violent the seizure. The boy's thrashed upon the ground, bruised and bloody before he can ultimately be healed. And we would think that maybe the closer we draw to Jesus would have a calming effect, a healing effect. But Luke tells us that as this call is growing darker and the move toward salvation is closer, that those who need help the most might encounter violence before the healing is complete. That trouble is brewing and this cloud of darkness is stretching across this road that Jesus has to take in order to confront the forces of death. And the stories from here on out are less about healing the physical symptoms that people are facing and more about confronting the realities of oppression. Here often described as what evil spirits are doing to people, these unnamed entities that seem to be all around us, that's causing sickness and division and death and frustration. And while we can't really just point it out and say, well, if this stops, it would stop all of that. And instead, it's just this presence in the air, it seems like, that is causing problems. What we find is that from now on, as Luke tells these stories, we are hearing stories of liberation and rebellion against death and sin and its minions. That people will be set free from their captors, but that often means that violence is coming to those who seek to liberate them. And even as Jesus is explaining to his followers that I'm going to Jerusalem, I'll be arrested and crucified and killed, there is no promise of resurrection in these foretellings of what's going to happen. He doesn't say, but don't worry, God, it'll all work out. By Sunday, it'll be good. Instead, the only story he has to share is that where I'm going, you're invited to follow, but it's going to be picking up our crosses. In this other story, Jesus calls children forward to welcome them in the midst of the disciples as an antidote to the poison of self-importance. And if you've ever had a kid rub their ketchup-laden fingers across your pants, you know what being humbled is like. Or your kids with sticky fingers wanting to hold your hand across the street. You're like, that's gross, man. Don't do that. Jesus' disciples are commanded to welcome the children who at this time in society are considered one of the least necessary contributors to the culture, to the society. They're sort of there until they get old enough that they can help out around the house. But for now, man, they just are an extra mouth to feed and they don't bring anything to the table. That if we're going to set out on this road of following Jesus, we too will risk our own safety and security to take in those who offer us nothing, but cost us something. And what Jesus tells us is how we respond to people like that among us shows us how we also respond to God. But again, who's going to argue against taking care of kids, right? That's the easiest out we can find. Well, or at least, again, my children, I'm happy to take care of. In fact, the rallying cry throughout any PTA meetings is, won't someone think of the children in policy debates? We're afraid of what may happen to the children if they were to read or learn about something that we don't want them to learn about. In fact, you've seen this rise of this idea of parents' rights groups that are happy to think about children as long as they conform to their personal ideals. And if you don't somehow conform to our personal ideals, then those kids, well, those are those kids. It often means wanting to restrict teaching about the experience of minority children. Stories about Ruby Bridges makes my kid feel bad, so let's not tell those stories. Or they don't want their kids exposed to the concept of families with gay parents. And so if we pretend they don't exist, it's easier to enact harmful laws against them. It makes sense, right? I've had people concerned about their kids learning about my son's adoption because they might come to find out that not every family is able to care for their children. And so is there a way we could maybe erase your son's story from everything, so my kid doesn't have to learn a hard truth about the world? I was so frustrated. Again, I learned this online, which goes to show me I should stop reading Facebook. But our own school district faced some resistance after the fires when children whose homes and schools and neighborhoods were burned were going to be allowed to attend here? Because now my kid has to contend with a higher student-to-teacher ratio? How unfair is the world around us? There was a little bit of subtext of also my kid has to go to school with brown and black people. I don't know about that. I came to La Cañada for a good reason. But Jesus will say that whoever welcomes kids, particularly the kids who are the most marginalized and harmed and threatened, welcomes me. That God calls us to embrace our weakness and the weak among us. That God calls us to see our loss instead reframed as an opportunity for life to erupt. That God calls us to give away what we treasure and find the treasure of heaven waiting for us. So much of the conversation around the ways that we would find freedom from spiritual forces that seek to oppress us is that we would become the oppressors, that we would pick up the sword and shield and gun and rhetoric in order to fight against the things that do harm to people. And so there's this sort of Christian understanding that says, well, I don't like what those people are doing, and so let's eradicate them, and then we will solve that problem. Let's silence them. Let's erase their stories. Let's pray against their success so that our needs will be filled. And what we find is that is very much that sort of mountaintop, build a campsite and hang out with Jesus all day sort of mentality that denies the story where Jesus says, we're not staying here. We're not here to build some fortress in the sky to keep all the riffraff away from us. And in fact, the best way that we can discover God in our midst is by going down the mountain and into the place where there are demons throwing kids on the ground, where there are hungry and starving and hurting people who would never climb this mountain, who would never find themselves inside a church. Because as far as they're concerned, God is not there. And so God says, okay, I'll be there with you then, down in this valley. And we are then called to follow God there. We are only briefly in this kind of setting. Enough to sort of see the glory of Jesus, right? Be encouraged. And then it's time to go back into the real world. Because what we find is that the glory of God and the death of Jesus and the vulnerability of children collide in order so we might learn what salvation looks like. We need the moments in this building where we can see the big picture of what God is trying to accomplish. The hope and salvation that forgiveness and peacemaking and hungering and thirsting for righteousness can do. How love and faith and hope are the things that remain when everything else fades away. But then we also are called to go and find the hungry and the broken, the lost and poor and frustrated, so that they too might see God. If we try to save ourselves, we are lost. If we seek to save our children alone while ignoring the ones who are hungry or homeless or bullied, we are lost. My hope is that we would hear not only the call of God to come to this place to worship, but also to go to those hidden and unseen places away from the mountaintop, so that we might hear the poor and the hurting and the lost and the lonely and make them welcome into our life. Just as Jesus would draw a child to him, that we would draw the families around us closer to us so that they might see how they are welcomed into the family of God. And that doing so, we welcome God into our life as well. Amen.